Yeah, sure. Okay, I guess we're starting. Uh, yeah. So today let's talk about tournament lineup. So basically, tournament lineups are just what. So we're talking about Riot's tournament format. That's free deck, one ban, best of free conquest with no duplicated champions or duplicated region combinations. So these are the assumptions we will start off with. Regarding tournaments, if you guys have any questions, just leave them in University of Runeterra text channel. I'll be reading that. We're going to assume that decks will be played to a very high level. So when we're talking matchups, these will be theoretical matchups, at a very high level, right? So we're going to assume that skill matchups will always be at the skill cap. So this is why we're assuming TF Fizz does beat Control, since at the highest level, the TF Fizz player will be able to put the Control player on a clock, and once the Control player is forced to clear the two Burble Fishes in the board, you can redevelop with iterative improvements and such. Um, Matchups will progress as they're supposed to. Theoretically, the favorite deck will always win. So if you're playing something like Lee Sin into TF Fizz will win 100% of the time. We're going to assume that because for that way we can put together lineups instead of having to account for at fringe cases where Lee Sin will beat TF Fizz, but usually that won't happen, right? Games are played using Riot format. That's free decks, one ban. We talked about that. All of the tournaments are open deck list, which means cheese cards that you run as one of, such as Judgment, Might, your opponent's going to be able to play around that. So you can't really cheese them with you can tech against them. That's different, but you can't really cheese them with any one of cards. And so examples of that would be Judgment Might, Sky's Descent. I think those are the most common ones. Tournament meta is different from ladder. In tournaments, you're going to see a lot more decks that do generally well. To that end, that's definitely TF is Fiora Shen probably. Uh, some Ash decks. Draven Ezreal is popular. Yeah, and you have to play the decks you select, at least to a competent degree. If you can't play the decks, probably better to not play it. It's I definitely recommend play something that you're more comfortable on than something that's stronger, but you have no idea how to pilot, right? Like TF Fizz is one of the strongest decks, but I'd say it's pretty hard to play. If you can't really play it well, I don't suggest bringing it. Okay, so we are going to put together a lineup. Basically, what you want is to target a archetype or a deck that's popular. So you want your decks to have the same flow. That means you want your decks to have similar weaknesses and to be able to win against a specific deck or archetype that you are going to see a lot, or that you think you're going to see a lot. So you're going to pick free decks that beat the archetype. Your decks will have similar weaknesses so that you can know what to ban. Like if you pick a bunch of decks that hard lose to TF like Lee Sin, and other decks that have no removal, but like Lee Sin's pretty good into control, so say you're running an anti-control lineup, that'd be like Freeze Real Lee Sin, that loses the TF Fizz. You can ban out TF Fizz so that you don't have that weakness, and then you should be even into most other matchups, which is the beauty of tournaments. Since you can cover your weaknesses through bans that make ladder decks that are bad currently, like Lee Sin, because it hard loses TF Fizz, good because you won't be able to see TF Fizz since you're hard banning it every single game. Ideally, you want even matchups into the archetype you don't plan on banning. So, like if you're loose to aggro, but you're trying to target control, you want your decks to generally have even matchups into mid-range decks. This usually happens for most. good decks. Like you definitely want to bring strong decks as well, even if they're older. Like Undying is a pretty old deck. Uh, Goldheart's actually probably playable. TF Swain still playable. Yeah, and target archetype like this here. It includes triple aggro stuff like TF is target TF is target mid range, target aggro. Triple control. It's more cheese when you bring triple of one archetype to target another archetype because if they don't have the archetype, you're unfavored, right? You're more vulnerable to matchup RNG. So if you're bringing triple aggro to cheese mid range decks or cheese TF Fizz, if someone brings double control, you can only ban out one of their if someone brings triple control, you can only ban out one of their control decks, and if you're unfavored versus both their other decks, you just lose, right? And there's another strategy, which is to bring free decks that have generally even matchups or like free strongest meta decks. So these are decks that can win basically every matchup somehow. So if your Shen's one historically, a Felios deck, just invokes. Usually you go heavier on the invokes. There's Fizz TF, Lee Sin, but you have to ban TF Fizz. Stuff like that. Okay, how are we banning? We need to have a clear idea of what you're going to ban because in the tournament, you don't have a lot of time to think about banning and you rather spend that time thinking on how the matchup will go rather than what you want to ban. When you're confused about what you want to ban, that's not a good thing. So we're already structuring our lineup so that we know what to ban, right? So like if we want to ban something, if we have like a triple of one archetype, we just ban the counter archetype. So like say you're triple aggro, you're going to ban whatever control deck they bring. If you're whatever archetype, if you're targeting something, you ban your weaknesses. So like if you're playing Lee Sin or something, you just ban TF Fizz. It's unplayable matchup. If you have an Azir deck, you ban Fiora, it's unplayable. Um, if you're like targeting control, you ban aggro because your lineup just doesn't deal with that. So that anti-control decks will be stuff like Undying and Freeze Rio. And then there's unplayable matchups. We've talked about this. Azir just hard loses Fiora. Lee Sin just hard loses to TF Fizz. Um, that's about it. Okay, so let's look at the example lineup. This is something I put together. It's a target Targon lineup because I do not like the purple region very much. So we will be banning out aggro and TF is probably TF is because TF is I think is the strongest deck right now. So if you don't bring TF is or you don't ban TF is, you need to bring and ban TF is if you want to win. That's my take on it, but some would disagree. Anyways, so we have Freeze Rio, Champions be Teemo Ezreal, it's anti-control, it's a combo deck. You beat Targon because you can find Foundry early, you drop it on free and you start milling them. Beast Control because direct damage Nexus with Puff Caps, you have time to set your combo. Most of your key units have free health, plus you have Elixir of Iron and Troll Chant to keep them alive. Elusive TF is can't deal with the elusives, there's no healing. Loses to aggro, it gets aggro, and it loses to burn. Rather unfortunate because it takes a while to get online. Um, yeah, the plan is just shuffle puff caps into his deck until he draws all of them and dies. List Trundle. I think the better version is the one with no ledge rolls, no atrocity. You just all in on the Watcher. It beats Targon. Otherwise, ledge rolls atrocity. If you don't all in on Watcher, it just gets silenced by Equinox or Hush, and you end up not being able to win through Watcher win condition. It shits on aggro. They added in three more avalanche effects There's Blighted Ravine now on top of your free avalanches, and they added Ice Shard for fast speed. Yeah, it loses to combo decks, loses to anti-control, which makes sense as control deck. TF is it beats basically everything. I don't think it has an unfavored matchup aside from Pirate Aggro. I think that's the only one. You can tech versus it. I've heard about people saying Vlad Braum was decent versus it. If you played like free Avalanche and free Ice Shard plus Death Lotuses and Ravines, that's like super tech. So it's a really crazy deck right now. They added stress testing, which completely destroys TF's power level because now you can consistently flip him on turn 5, which is just insane because TF flip is game winning. Uh, what are the general weaknesses of this lineup? We lose to aggro. If you get cheesed by triple aggro, you kind of lose just instantly. Um, high skill cap. Uh, the decks are pretty hard, I'd say. I don't think I can play them to full potential. Um, which is rather unfortunate since, yeah, and, like if you're playing combo decks, you're more vulnerable to bricking. Like sometimes you just don't find Foundry versus Targon, and it just hurts inside, you know. What are the strengths? Beast Targon, that's good. If you're expecting a lot of purple region, yeah, I'm not sure how much purple region will be presented in the tournament. I've maybe maybe I won't see that much of it since everyone's bringing TF Fizz. And all decks have even and favored matchups into mid-range lists, which is true for most of the decks you can see in the meta. Most of the decks do beat mid-range right now, which is crazy. Mid-range is. Anyways, this is our bad lineup where the decks have no synergistic purposes and their weaknesses are all over the place and you have no idea what to ban. So this is what not to do. So we have a Zero Lucian, beats mid-range and other aggro decks, and it beats like bigger control decks, but not Noxian Freljord control. It's really reliant on high rolling, right? But I'll cover this more in University of Runeterra later. But it's really reliant on high rolling. It's bad against Ice Shard, and it loses to Culling Strike and Flock. So it's bad against stuff like Draven Ezreal or Noxian based removal. Um, we have a Nivea, which is control deck. It beats aggro and mid range. Loses to anti-control, loses to combo, loses to faster mid-range decks like Pirate Burn. It loses to burn decks. We have TF Swain, which beats aggro and mid-range, and it loses to Equinox, controlless, slower mid-range, large units, so like stuff like Endear, Nasus Atrocity. So the issue here, right, is we have a deck that loses to control. We have a deck that loses to mid-range and combo, and we have another deck that loses to control and mid-range. So what exactly can you ban here? Because the issue is that you have no idea what to ban, other than you shouldn't ban aggro. But then you have like a deck that's fine into TFs, as your Lucian can race them pretty well. You have a deck that loses, and then you have a deck that wins into TFs. And then there's no clear idea of what you're banning. The decks don't have a similar flow or anything. Um, they do completely different things. One's a control deck, one's a mid range, one's an aggro deck. Uh, yeah, it's just not pretty. Yeah, they hard nerfed TF Swain and my boy Riptide Rex. Sad. You don't have clear ban. Can't think. Have like you can't cover your weaknesses, which is a huge part of playing a tournament. You want to be able to cover your weaknesses of your deck with bans. You just have too much going on at the same time. Like you have no goal for your lineup. Like what are you trying to accomplish? Are you just bringing decks and hoping that they work? Like the decks individually they fit in different lineups, But when you put them together, like they're just not. That's not it, man. Yeah, that's basically all I have today. Oh, thanks for coming to my TED Talk, guys.